This is overwhelming. Now, be honest. Were you told to clap? You were told to clap. That wasn't spontaneous. From now on, just clap spontaneously. But not then. I got to tell you, I'm so overwhelmed to be here in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and I'm so thrilled to all of you who came out this evening. I know that when something is free, people tend to show up. But I know that it's more than that, that you are actually excited about being here. And I'm so excited you're here. I'm not kidding. To my mind, this is an historic event. And I hope I can make that clear to you, or the evening as it unfolds, you will understand how important this is. This is not just another Socrates in the City event, although those aren't so bad, but this is particularly special. Now, I have to tell you, most of you who are here know this, but those watching at home may not know this. This hotel is so extraordinary. It is built, I didn't know this, on what was the home of Count Zinzendorf. When I found that out, I thought, is this a joke? Because in my research for my book on William Wilberforce, and in my research for my book on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, both times I bump into the Moravians and Zinzendorf. Zinzendorf is like one of the heroes of heroes. Without him, Bonhoeffer, now some of you will know Bonhoeffer, and if you don't, shame on you. But if you don't know, there's plenty of books, and I'll tell you later. But the point is that his mother was involved in Germany with, it was called the Herrenhüter. It was a Moravian group. We can trace Wilberforce's faith through people to Zinzendorf. Zinzendorf was a hero, and he lived right here. Is it freaking you out? I saw his ghost in the laundry room, and no, I'm sorry, in the weight room, in the fitness center. I saw the ghost of the Count. But this is really, as a Christian, I guess I would call this holy ground. This is a really amazing thing that in 1741, that hero was literally here. So when I found that out, I just said, why don't we do an event there in Bethlehem? Because, Dr. Michael Behe lives here and teaches, as some of you know, at Lehigh University. How cool would it be if we could go there and do an event here? So I just have to say, I'm so excited about this. Before I forget, I want to thank the Discovery Institute for funding most of this tonight and making it possible for you freeloaders, and you know who you are. No, not all of you, but some of you know who you are. Free wine, come on. Where do you get free wine? So the Discovery Institute really has made this possible, and so I'm thrilled, because obviously I wanted as many people who could come to come. I have not yet told you about Dr. Michael Behe. Now, this rarely happens, and this is kind of a cheat. If somebody does this, it's kind of like they're cheating because they were lazy. So I'm gonna read the flap copy from his book. Earlier today, while I was preparing my remarks, I glanced at the flap copy to get some ideas, and it struck me that unfortunately, I could never, ever do better than the flap copy. Now, as an author who has read the flap copy on my books, I can tell you it often doesn't do justice to what's inside the book. And I hate those people who wrote the flap copy on my book, and I'm going to track them down at some point when I have more time. Because people read the flap copy, they go, it's not good, and they put the book down, they don't buy it. So whoever wrote the flap copy, I'm going to read it now. And if you wrote this flap copy, would you stand? I'm just curious. Anybody? No? Somebody should take credit, because I'd have no idea. Let me just read this. It'll frame things this evening better than I could. While Stephen Colbert has called Michael Behe the father of intelligent design. Now, most of you know Stephen Colbert is a renowned man of science. And there's no need to mock, all right? He's not the greatest scientist, but he's the best they could get for the flap copy. Stephen Colbert has called Michael Behe the father of intelligent design. Now, if you don't know what intelligent design is, we're going to talk about that tonight. Behe's arguments have been called close to heretical by the New York Times Book Review. You want to talk about a badge of honor. And Richard Dawkins has publicly taken him to task for his maverick views. Because we don't like mavericks in America, right? We like people who toe the line. Wherever he goes, Behe makes waves, but he has remained singularly focused on doing rigorous scientific analysis that points to controversial but incredible results that other scientists won't touch. This research led Behe to challenge Darwin's theory of evolution. What? That's crazy. I had no idea. This is like, I'm not prepared. Are you crazy? What are you doing? Wow. That's just straight up crazy. Okay. His research, just imagine, you want to talk about courage, led him to challenge Darwin's theory of evolution in his seminal bestseller, Darwin's Black Box, which came out in 1996, arguing that science itself has proven that an intelligent design is a better explanation for the origin of life. Obviously better than Darwin's thesis, right, of natural selection. Now, 20 years later, Behe shows that new scientific discoveries made possible only in the past few decades, and this is where I get excited because I had Dr. Behe on my radio show the other day. This is all new science, new information. Point to a stunning fact. Darwin's mechanism works by a process of devolution, not evolution. We'll discuss that. The mechanism works by breaking down genes, which means that evolution can help make something look and act different, at least on the surface, but it doesn't have the ability to build or create anything at the genetic level. We'll get into that. Critically analyzing the latest research, Behe gives a sweeping tour of how modern theories of evolution fall short and how the devolving nature of Darwin's mechanism limits them even further. If we're to get a satisfactory answer to how the most complex, stunning life forms arose, and by the way, we are those life forms. Yeah, congratulate yourself. We need to look beyond Darwin. It's time to acknowledge the conclusion that only an intelligent mind could have designed life. Well, some of you already know Dr. Michael Behe. He's a biochemist and the author of a number of books, but he is a professor of biochemistry at Lehigh, and I cannot believe I have him as my guest tonight. Please welcome Dr. Michael Behe. Oh, we go this way. After you. This guy. Incredible. This is the guy. That's the guy. Thank you. I am so excited that you were willing to do this, because as you know, I'm going to give you a hard journalistic grilling. You're going to look like Nixon in 1960 versus JFK. It's going to get ugly, but we're interested in the truth here. You and I spoke on my radio program the other day, and there's so much I want to talk about, but I know there are a lot of people here who literally don't even know, like, let's say, what intelligent design is. So would you do us a favor and give us a brief synopsis of what exactly is what we call intelligent design?
Well, intelligent design is simply the idea that rather than just the forces of nature, some intelligent being planned or arranged something. And we can tell that's the case oftentimes when we see parts that seem not to have anything to do with each other put together to make something that can do something beyond those parts itself.
Okay, now when you say an intelligent being or whatever, you don't say that it's the God of the Bible. You just say it looks like there's design, but you're not getting into who it was.
That's right. I think from DNA, from the molecular machinery of the cell, you can tell that it was designed, but there's no signature in the cell, even though Stephen Meyer said there was.
Right.
So the argument is limited to design itself.
Okay, so intelligent design is different from what some people call creationism. Because I think that part of the reason people don't like talking about this is I've always noticed that there's a false dichotomy between, there's some people who say, the earth is 8,000 years old and if you don't believe that, you got to throw the Bible away, and that's that. And we're not going to get into, you're not saying that. You're saying, I mean, if somebody said to you, how old do you think the Earth is? What would you say?
Well, I think it's billions of years old. I'm happy to take physicists' word on it.
So by billions, like 4 billion?
Yes. Uh-huh.
Would you go to 3? 4. All right. How old would you say the universe is?
Whatever the current estimate is, 13 and a half, I think, right now.
I think it's 13.8, but close enough.
Yeah.
Close enough. Your view is that we've been here for a long time, that the universe has been here, the Earth has been here, and you believe that there was life on this planet, whatever, starting like almost 1 billion years ago?
Probably soon after the Earth formed is the best estimate these days.
And so literally like
4 billion years.
4 billion years,
Yeah.
like trilobites or something like that?
Well, no, single-celled type organisms. You can only see the kind of chemical traces of earlier life.
Okay.
Single cells.
But so you're saying that life's been here for a very, 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 very long time. Your colleague and someone I've interviewed at Socrates in the City twice, Stephen Meyer, talks about sort of what you talk about in your first book, the cell. And what fascinates me is, tell us about, I mean, Darwin lived at a time when no one knew what was inside a cell. So they just talked very cavalierly about evolution and stuff. Tell us what happened in science in the last 100 years that leads you to write your first book, Darwin's Black Box, and that leads Stephen Meyer to write Signature in the Cell. What do we know that we didn't know when Darwin was hanging out?
Well, when Darwin first started, the cell was thought to be a piece of jelly, protoplasm. Some buddies of Darwin's got some mud from an exploring ship and looked at it under a microscope and thought they saw cells there, and so therefore thought cells would bubble up spontaneously from the ocean depths. So that's just to give you an example of how primitive science was compared to today. But in the 100 years or so, we've discovered that there are molecules in the cell. People back then didn't even know molecules were real.
How embarrassing. We all know that.
Yeah,
it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Okay.
And as more and more of the cell was studied, DNA was discovered. It turned out that DNA carried information that it
So now we're talking about Crick and Watson?
Yes.
Okay, so
in the 50s.
fairly recently.
Uh-huh.
Okay,
That's right.
But we didn't, I mean, yeah, it's hard to believe, like, we literally didn't know about DNA until very recently. I mean, there are many people in this room who were around before we discovered DNA. So it's like 10 minutes ago, and obviously Darwin didn't have the beginning of a clue of any of these things.
That's right. Yeah, he figured the basis of life was simple, jelly, protoplasm, and, well, maybe that could shape itself or stretch itself into pretty much anything.
Isn't it weird, like, if you read science fiction from maybe the 20s or something like that, they talk about protoplasm, and they talk about that stuff, like it was a thing. And now we know, like, there was no such thing, but it kind of was in vogue. Okay, so we have to ask the question. Darwin was a well-meaning scientist. He and Alfred Russel Wallace come up with this concept of natural selection or whatever. And in many ways, of course, it is very plausible. And in that day, it was eminently plausible because they didn't know that the universe was 13.8 billion years old. They thought it was infinitely old and there was an infinite amount of time. So now that we know what we know, what is it that you think makes it so difficult for other scientists to at least say, Houston, we have a problem, evolution has problems?
Well, as you know, science and religion have a history. And back in the day before Darwin, every educated person thought life was designed. And it was obvious because, birds have wings and fish have gills and so on, all these things that fit them to their environment. And Darwin Darwin proposed this non-intelligent explanation for life, and biology, which was then kind of struggling to become a professional science in its own right, loved it, because now we don't have to ask, the pastors and the ministers for permission to say something about life. We'll just figure it all out on our own. So there's a kind of a professional jealousy. People want biology to be able to be explained in the same way that physics and chemistry can be explained. So there's a history.
But I guess, even in my own stumbling research on a very popular level, I'm amazed at how there's more and more and more information that keeps coming out. Your book, when I talked to you on my radio program this week, the idea that you're writing about stuff that we've known for like 20 years or less.
Yes.
And that's what enabled you to write this book. Let's get to the thesis of the book. When you say Darwin Devolves, and the subtitle is The New Science About DNA That Challenges Evolution, the new science about DNA. So what is new that even in 1995 we could not have known that you now know and put in the book?
Well, it turns out mutations, which are the fodder for evolution, are changes in molecules in DNA.
Yeah.
When you switch something in DNA, it changes the instructions, make it code for something else. And we did not have the technology back then to see what the changes were. Most of the time, people would see that there was a change in an organism and it did better. And they said, look, this mutant is doing better than it did before.
Okay.
Isn't Darwin's theory grand?
Okay, now before you give us the rest of that story, so just to be clear, I want to make sure everybody's tracking, right? So and there's some people here who know tons about this, but maybe some don't. But so the idea is that Darwin and the people, his champions throughout the decades, said that, look, it makes sense that mutations happen. Okay. Now, I wonder if that's a great bumper sticker, right? Like, I would think that biochemists would you can use that. I'll just give that to you.
Thank you.
So mutations happen. And we know, that's inappropriate laughing, please. And we know that, we just know that mutations happen. So they said, okay, if mutations happen, given an infinite amount of time, which in those days they thought we had, because they didn't know about the Big Bang and so on and so forth, they said it only makes sense that a good mutation will help that creature to thrive, and another good mutation will help it thrive more. So the good mutations eventually will lead to better creatures, and that's the process of evolution over the eons. They believed that given enough time, mutations would create effectively us.
That's correct. And you have to remember they didn't know what a mutation was. And Darwin didn't talk about mutations, but rather about variation. And so,
when did mutations come into it?
In around the turn of the 20th century or so, people started to look at that. After Gregor Mendel and his pea garden in Austria started genetics. But they would say things like, well, if you were a deer and the weather turned colder and a baby deer was born with longer fur, why, that would be better. And maybe if it got colder still and the children of that, the offspring of that got even longer, that would be even better. So they were thinking in terms of improving body features.
I mean, I never use the phrase, but it's what we call survival of the fittest.
Yes.
Okay, so the ones that happened to be best adapted survived and thrived and mated and had more of the same, and this process goes on and on. Okay.
Exactly. But people never said, well, that's great, but how does that explain complex features when you have to put a few things together? And Darwin kind of treaded lightly around that and waved it off and says, we'll figure that out later when we understand more about biology. But that turns out to be the key critical question. How does complex changes, how do they come about?
Okay, so we're not going to have time tonight, but when you say complex changes, in other words, when you're talking about the length of hair or on the cover of your book, you have Darwin's famous finches, right? So if you got a finch, some finches have bigger beaks, some have more narrow beaks, whatever. Not exactly complicated, right? It's like the hair of the deer. It's like simple. But you're talking about how does a whale come into being? And the suggestion, of course, is what? That some mammals eventually are wandering in the water and that, suddenly, Shazam, it's a whale.
Yeah.
I mean, David Berlinski brilliantly mocks this stuff in his writings because it is very funny when you start talking about, okay, so what's necessary for a land mammal to become a whale, who's also a mammal? What's necessary? And the number of things, like it's so complex that it becomes a kind of madness. So if you say that to a strict Darwinist, what do they say?
They say you're a creationist.
So name calling is the order of the day.
Name calling and condescension, and at best, what you'll get is what's known in the trade as a just so story, where people give kind of a semi plausible account of perhaps one feature of an organism developing. And it sounds, shaky, but then they say, well, clearly that could have happened. That could have happened. So therefore, there's no reason you can't think that happened and this happened, and we don't get to the point where they all become integrated into one system.
Okay, but before we get to the specifics of your theory in the book, I still want to ask, we have now had so much time pass between 1859 and the publication of The Origin of Species and today, and we've had so many new things that, to look at, right? But one of the biggest ones we've mentioned is time. The idea that at some point in the 20th century, there came the thesis of the Big Bang. Boyle, or is it Hoyle, names the Big Bang. And then slowly you get more and more proof for the Big Bang, and then you get the consensus of scientists saying, yes, we believe the universe is finite. There's a finite number of years that we have to work with for what we call evolution, right? So when we put forward the idea, as you have and other proponents of intelligent design, that we don't have enough time and we don't even have close to enough time, has anybody responded? Have any scientists responded in anything that is not merely ad hominem?
Well, yes. Actually, some people have published papers in official science journals addressing such questions. And these days, if you address a question that is relevant to intelligent design and evolution, it kind of bumps your paper up a couple of notches if you are going to try to take down evolution.
Kind of like more retweets. Just I want to break it down for the young people.
That's right.
Yeah. And they're like, we stopped Twitter 10 years ago. But so it's still like a hot topic.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean,
absolutely.
and so okay, all right.
And to answer the previous question, there was a paper in a leading journal, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, titled, "Is There Enough Time for Evolution?" Specifically saying these intelligent design folks say that there's not enough time, and going through a calculation to show that there was. But of course, calculations and models, depend on your assumptions, and the fellow writing this assumed that, well, once you got an improvement, you could get another one. Essentially just assumed Darwin's theory was true and said, voila, there's no problem. He didn't discuss any of the stumbling blocks that ID folks have pointed out. It was a cartoon model.
I remember literally like 30 years ago reading a cover article in the Atlantic Monthly that dealt with the issue of how did life come into being in the first place. So forget about life evolving, right? But just how do you get like the first cell, the first anything? And the article, I mean, we talk about courage and willingness to face the facts. I mean, the article in the Atlantic effectively said, in all the time that we've been looking at this, we are no closer to an answer. We have no idea, which is very different from, the Miller experiment where they kind of, well, it happened like this, right? And then we'll give you the details. And then the decades pass, no details. So, like, that's one level of that's not explained. But
yes.
you're now talking about a completely new level. So I want to get to that idea. So at some point somebody says, okay, evolution goes by, we don't call it variations, now it's mutations, and now we can look at mutations. So what is it in the last 20 years that makes it clear that that can't work?
Well, it's our ability to track down helpful changes, helpful mutations in the DNA. As I said earlier, we couldn't do that before. People would see some bacteria grow better in a certain environment, or a bunny rabbit have a different coat color and blend into the snow better.
You can just say rabbit. It's just it's a scientific audience. They can take it.
And but they couldn't track down what was going on. Now we can.
Why?
Because of technology. Everybody, I think, has heard of the Human Genome Sequencing Project, where the DNA complement of humans has been deciphered letter by letter by letter by letter, 3 billion or so. But that was really tough sledding. It took a decade or so, billions and billions of dollars. But it's kind of like computers back in the 50s. They took up rooms and they were clunky and expensive. Now you've got computers in your hands which can access the world. Same thing with DNA sequencing technology. It has become faster and cheaper and easier. And now people can sequence genomes of brand new organisms, in an afternoon, have their graduate student go into the lab and say, sequence that for me. And so now we can track down these mutations.
Okay, so the big news that enables you to write this devastating book is that it's no longer speculation. We now can look at the actual mutations and determine whether they are helping the organism and how. And based on your research,
well, it turns out that they do help them. There's lots of mutations that help. But the bottom line is that overwhelmingly, the mutations are ones that break things that were already there. They take genes that are working in some organisms and figuratively snap them and throw them away, and that helps in some circumstances. And people might wonder, how can breaking something help? Well, if you think of your car, suppose your life depended on you getting better gas mileage for your car. What's a quick and easy way to get better gas mileage? Well, of course, you can throw things away. You can take off weight. You can take the doors and throw them away. Take the hood and throw it away. Of course, those are useful in some circumstances. But if right now your life depended on your car getting better gas mileage, the way to go is to throw those out. The cell does that too.
I just imagine a lot of people are thinking, well, so what? In other words, if mutation is the genetic code is broken here and that helps, why is that a problem for Darwinism?
Well, because it shows that Darwin's mechanism is actually powerfully devolutionary rather than evolutionary. It strongly tends to break things, throw them away, like the example I talked about, and that's not going to be something that constructs sophisticated molecular machinery such as we found in the cell.
Okay, so what you're saying is if I have a wolf and I want to breed dogs of various kinds, which basically has happened, right? You're saying that it's not a process of evolution, it's a process of devolution, meaning that you take the standard dog model of DNA and you break stuff off of it. So tell us about that.
Yeah, believe it or not, the complete DNA genome has been sequenced not only of wolves and not only of a particular dog, but dozens of breeds of dogs, purebred dogs with different features so that people can track down what's going on, what is causing them to have smaller stature or fuzzier fur or other features. And it turns out that to a very large extent, it's due to breaking genes that were already there. There's genes involved in fur that if you break them, makes it curlier. And genes involved in bone growth, if you break them, it'll be shorter. And there's developmental genes that help a snout develop. And if you break that, you get a truncated snout like in a bulldog. So we did show how Darwin's theory works by artificial selection. But it's working by breaking genes.
I feel like what you're saying, though, is that, in other words, what this is leading us to conclude is there are these models that exist. There's a dog, there's a cat, there are these different things, and you're saying that we can have microevolution, and we can break the genes, and so we can make this kind of a cat or this kind of a dog, but we can never, because we're not adding genes or whatever, you can never breed a dog that will become a giraffe or a horse. You can never break out of the dog wheel rut, so to speak. Like, it's always going to be some kind of dog.
That's correct. And more than that, you can think that, well, as this dog is selected for various things, say a French poodle or so on,
right,
those genes are thrown away and they're gone. They're not coming back. So the ability of the dog that has already been selected
right,
to adapt to a different environment becomes more and more restricted, so that it becomes evolutionarily brittle.
What you just said, though, because I want this to be clear for the layman, and because scientists like us, we understand this stuff, but they don't know that I'm a scientist, but I know. So here's the issue. You're saying, I think, that Darwinists have been saying, for example, that there are no limits, that there are no boundaries, that a species is fluid, and that if I were to breed dogs long enough, I could get them as tiny as a housefly. But in reality, you're saying, no, the limits of dogness, and I just coined that word, are fixed. And the same thing with how big dogs can get. Because I think to those of us who don't know science, you'd sort of think like, look, why couldn't I breed a dog as big as this room? Why? But you're saying I can't.
Well, Clifford accepted.
Yes, right. And he's red, which is a whole other...
That's correct. Actually, I write in the book about a number of what I call luxuriantly evolving species, particularly on islands, such as the Galapagos, Darwin's finches. And it turns out there's a number of them. The finches have been on the Galapagos for millions of years, and they've formed about a dozen or 16 species. It's kind of uncertain. And a couple of, the next level up is genera, or genus, but no new families. And that's the next level up. And there are other rapidly evolving fish called cichlids in African lakes. And they have been there just 15,000 years. And it's known that because of the Lake Victoria, evaporated 15,000 or so years ago. And these species are found nowhere else in the world. And there's about 1,000 of them, new species, and a number of new genera. No new families, though. And the level of biological family is like the cat family versus the dog family, okay? Lions and tigers and wolves and foxes and so on. And I make the case in the book that is the limit of Darwinian unguided evolution. You can have new species and new genera, but you can't make a new family by unguided evolution.
As I've talked to Stephen Meyer about this, he seems to suggest that in Europe, not so much here, there are people at the cutting edge of this world in science who are open to talking about this, and that at the very highest level conferences, there isn't quite the fear that you find, let's say, in the faculty lounge at Lafayette or Lehigh, to pick something out of the, the book.
Lafayette.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's correct.
We're going to cut that out in
Yeah,
post. I
okay.
apologize. I apologize sometimes.
Yeah, it's surprising but true that I would estimate that at least a third of professional biologists, academic biologists, think that Darwin's theory is inadequate, that it doesn't.
Stop. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Say that again.
About a third of non-intelligent design academic biologists are fed up with Darwin's theory.
Okay, that's huge to me. I'd like to hear that.
Yeah.
Okay.
And yet, it's only talked about in professional journals and meetings. When the public media gets hold of it, it's all Darwin all the time, and it is presented as a united front, that science says that Darwin's theory is known to explain everything. But professional biologists know there's problems with it.
Well, even I remember Stephen Jay Gould at Harvard beginning to be honest about this kind of stuff, obviously before he died some years ago. But he was sort of a popular scientist and who wrote popular essays. But he was honest about that, wasn't he? That we have problems sort of in-house.
Yeah. And he got into trouble for it too.
Even he got into trouble.
Even he, yeah, right.
Well, imagine the trouble you're going to get into.
Yeah.
Holy cow. So that's interesting to me. I didn't realize that.
A few years ago, there was a kind of two dueling letters to the journal Nature. Nature is the most prominent science journal in the world. And the letters were by two groups of scientists, one saying that Darwin's theory is great, and the other one saying that we need to move beyond it. There are things that it doesn't account for. So, this is in the premier science journal in the world, people saying that Darwin cannot cover everything. And what's interesting in the skeptical letter, the one that said that Darwin's theory doesn't really cover everything, that they said, we know that fear of intelligent design makes a lot of people want to circle the wagons and pretend that Darwin's theory covers everything. They talked about that explicitly. So a lot of this is due to fear of letting the great unwashed know the state of the biology.
And what is the big fear? I mean, is it fear that science is pointing to something like the God of the Bible, and that's just repulsive to some people? I mean, is that it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
What else is there to say?
My friend John, the brilliant John Zmirak, was at a Socrates in the City event that I did with your friend Stephen Meyer a couple months ago, and was so inspired by the whole intelligent design discussion that we had that he wrote an article. It just came out at stream.org, and I talked to him on my radio program about it earlier today. He came up with a compromise. He said, I've got a great compromise for the atheists and the intelligent design people that we can all agree on that's going to help everybody. And he said, the problem seems to be that the atheists don't like the concept of that it was a God that did the design. But they kind of know that it looks like there was design, but they can't admit it because it points to God. So his compromise is, why don't we just all agree to say that, look, we know there's probably a designer, but let's say that that designer is just an alien on Alpha Centauri who doesn't care whom we sleep with, who doesn't care about what we do or human morality. And so since that designer doesn't care, we can be honest about the science.
That's a great idea.
Isn't it?
But it's interesting. He wrote it as a parody, but I don't know, probably some folks in the audience know, but back in the day, back in the 70s somewhere, Francis Crick of Watson and Crick fame, co-discoverers of the shape of DNA, co-wrote an article with a guy named Leslie Orgel entitled Directed Panspermia. Directed Panspermia.
This is a family show.
Yeah.
So you don't...
All right, I'll leave out the pan part then.
Right. Any references to Pan or Bacchus or Dionysus could lead people astray.
Right, yeah.
A lot of people they already had 4 glasses of the free grape juice out there, so we don't need to go there. Okay, so what does that mean? And this is Francis Crick, the famous Francis Crick. Okay.
And essentially, it was that the problems with figuring out an origin of life on Earth were so great, people had no clue that maybe we should look into the idea that space aliens from a different planet shot rockets all over the universe carrying spores to seed other planets. And that's how life started. Of course, that just leads to, pushes the problem to the next planet over.
But that's what's so funny.
Yeah.
Right?
But
it's kind of like he did it. And it's like, okay, and then let's question him. It's like, no, you can't talk to him.
But Francis Crick said that, well, maybe there was some special substance on another planet that we don't have here. Maybe kryptonite or something like that would get life started. So the point is that...
This is getting funny now. So you have these eminent scientists, effectively, because they dare not, use the word, but it's kind of like they're saying there could be some magic on that planet that creates life.
Exactly.
And that's our explanation. Like, that's the scientific explanation. It's probably magic from another planet, which is madness. I mean, it's like it's like the multiverse theory.
Exactly. And actually, now that you brought that up, 30, 40 years on from Crick's presentation, another fellow named Eugene Koonin, who is a very prominent scientist, not of the stature of Crick, but very prominent, he says that the problems with imagining an origin of life on Earth are so great that maybe we are the lucky universe in 10 to the 1,000th power universes, and that would get life started, he said. So essentially,
Man, that's lucky.
A wave of wave of the hands.
But it becomes funny. Again, I approach this stuff from a popular level, but it's always a staggering thing to see people that you're supposed to respect, like scientists, resorting to that kind of chicanery and foolishness. I mean, it's embarrassing, but they would rather, in effect, posit an infinity of universes than deal with the most obvious Occam's razor answer is, there's design. And it's horrifying to me that we're at that state in the world of quote-unquote science.
Yes, you have to realize that you can postulate, 10 to the 1,000th universes or space aliens sending rockets around, but there's one strict rule about what you can't posit. Guess what that might be? It's that there is an intelligent being that has the power to build and plan and make life.
Even though, again, ironically, that seems to be, even if you don't believe it, you have to concede that that's probably the most logical, right? In other words, it might be the most logical, and you could say, well, I don't want to believe it, or it's distasteful. I hope there's another reason. But it's not even like it's close anymore. Like, it's getting, Stephen Meyer is writing a book now called The Return of the God Hypothesis. Like, the evidence has become so outrageous that it's kind of embarrassing. I feel sorry for scientific materialists and for scientific scientists, because it's looking bad.
Well, and the only thing I really hold against such folks who posit these outrageous things is that they don't admit in public that they don't know what's going on. They say they will join forces with the greater groups of scientists to say, we've got it under control, don't you worry your little heads about it. We don't need to tell you this,
right.
Even though practically everybody in the history of the world has believed in a designer, believed that life needed to be made, to be created. They won't let kids know. They'll lie to children and tell them that we got it all under control, or they'll kind of say mealy-mouthed words so that they're not actually saying that they have the answer, but they say, but we will, and
right.
science is a search for the truth. And this,
well, it's a weird thing because, I know that people on both sides of this do that, right? We all know people of faith, right, who find some problem in their hypothesis, or they find some problem in the Bible or some problem in archaeology or something like that, and it troubles them, and they honestly feel like, well, I can't talk about that, or I have to build some Rube Goldberg device around this problem, rather than say, look, I only want to believe in what is true, and if there's a God, he's the God of truth, so I don't have to worry about the evidence or something like that, and they kind of, they circle the wagons, but we've heard a lot about that, but we never hear about scientists who you're, saying that this is effectively what they're doing.
Yeah, everybody has a worldview, and they will oftentimes go to great lengths to protect that. And as you say, religious people certainly do, but that has been looked at pretty thoroughly in the media. The opposite, though, the worldviews of scientists, that they will not entertain an idea of design of something outside the universe affecting it. That is, that's not interesting to many reporters because they kind of share that view, and it's just the modern way of thinking.
Well, I guess what I find funny, I wrote a book called Miracles, which in the beginning of it I deal with the fine-tuned universe stuff, and I obviously stole everything there from John Lennox and some of your friends, but the point is that even I could see like what science is. Science is our ability to describe the universe. So using evidence, using the scientific method, using our five senses, we can learn and learn and learn and learn. But I realize that there are limits to science. So science can tell me, about the universe, but science can never tell me why the universe exists or whether there is a reason. Like, that's impossible for science. So some of what you're talking about strikes me as being, ironic, that you have scientists in a way, and not in a way, clearly going outside the precincts of science and making postulations based on a kind of faith in something. They don't want to believe there's a God, and they ought really to be properly agnostic on that.
That's true, but scientists are very poor philosophers as a rule, and they don't realize oftentimes that that's what they're doing. They've kind of imbibed their assumptions from other places. But a lot of people forget. I myself think science can conclude that some things have a purpose, like eyes. Eyes have a purpose. You might think that, say, you don't know what a purpose of a cow is, but the purpose of a cow's eye is obvious. The purpose of a cow's udder is obvious.
Utterly.
Utterly.
I apologize.
Yeah.
We're going to cut that out also. Well, I guess what I'm saying is, and I'm stealing this also from John Lennox, but the point is that there are limits to science. And I think what has happened is that if a scientist is uncomfortable with that, he begins to saying everything that's not science is stupid. It's like somebody who loves baked goods and has a bakery, and anything that is not a baked good, like, we can't talk about it, it's stupid. Like, rather than just saying, I like baked goods, and that's my field, they kind of act like anything outside of that field can't exist. And so you have scientists declaring off limits any reasonable speculation, which is to say any philosophy, as somehow not just not science, but anti-science.
Yeah. Yeah, and you can see how, from that, how unreflective many scientists are, because it's been known for 60 years by philosophers that philosophy, which they called logical positivism, that only things that could be measured and so on are real, is self-contradictory, because there's no scientific experiment that can be done to show that nothing outside science can be known. So, it's self-refuting. What's more, scientists don't think that, well, okay, only scientific knowledge gives, or scientific experiments give knowledge. Well, how about mathematics? Should we throw out mathematics? Mathematics isn't science.
It's obviously anti-science.
It's helpful. How about logic? How about developing theories? When you first get a theory, what experiment told you that you should make up that theory? Nothing.
But isn't it true that, everything you're saying, it's common sense. Like, everyone knows this, except people who insist it's just wrong. Like they just don't want to go there, or they subvert their own common sense, because it seems it's just so reasonable that it's almost funny.
And yeah, it is, and we're kind of riding on the knowledge that we had over the millennia, but the basic clash between that view and our lived lives is that view at bottom wants to get rid of minds. It wants to get rid of everybody's mind and say there's no such thing. What
you mean, because I know a lot of people are going to miss this, I just happen to know this because I'm smarter than them. When you say mind, what you're saying, I know what you're saying, I want everybody to understand it. You're saying they will say brains exist, but minds do not exist. In other words, everything that's consciousness is just a brain, which is just a computer. You're saying mind is something else. So explain that a little bit.
That's exactly right. That they will say brains exist because evolution built brains for us, and that everything at bottom is matter, so that when you think and you think you're thinking, you're not really thinking in the traditional sense of thinking, because it's natural laws that are determining what your thought processes are.
And ironically, the people who think that are actually not thinking.
There's ironies everywhere you look in this topic. But a man named Francis Crick wrote a book 20 years or so ago called The Amazing Hypothesis, I believe the title was, The Astounding Hypothesis. And essentially that it says, you are nothing but a pack of neurons.
How dare you? My wife is in the audience. Take that back. But so that's the point of view. That's really, it's a dramatic thing. It says that there is literally no such thing as good or evil. Yeah. That what is, there is no meaning. There's no good, there's no evil, there's no transcendence. The love that I have for my parents or my wife or my daughter, that's just evolution making me feel something to perpetuate the species. But there's nothing transcendent. Love doesn't exist. Mind doesn't exist. None of that is real. And they're insisting on this.
That's correct. And that's where scientific materialism leads. Not only love doesn't exist, you don't exist. And I don't exist. Nobody exists here. There are philosophers cheered on by scientists who say that there is no consciousness. Consciousness is an illusion. You say, wait a second. An illusion in what?
It's a pretty good illusion.
Yeah. Don't I have to have a consciousness to have an illusion of consciousness? And so it turns out that all of this stuff is related.
Yeah.
The ability to see purpose and design in life was thrown out by Darwin's theory. And it ultimately leads to denying humanity, denying anything exists beyond the physical level.
Okay, but what I find interesting is those scientists never really come out and say that, because that would be so unpopular, the mobs would come for them.
Oh, they do say that.
Well, but they don't say it publicly. They're not going to say it to a Time magazine reporter, to New York Times. They understand that it's, first of all, very ridiculous, but it's also, even if people buy it, it just feels wrong. Like, it feels mistaken. And they don't seem to be pushing that idea.
That's right. I think they're kind of screened by the media, who will see how it will be perceived as, really ridiculous.
We just have a few minutes left, and I have to ask you, how many years have you been teaching at Lehigh?
Ooh, got here in 85, so.
85?
Uh-huh. So.
I'll bet you didn't have a gray beard in them days.
No.
Wow. Are you kidding? 34 years now?
30, time flies, yeah.
What year did you get tenure?
That's a great question. It was actually 88, because I came here after being faculty at Queens College in New York City. So I had already had 3 years under my belt.
Okay, so my question is, when did you come to believe in the things you believe now? Was it after you got tenure?
Hey, my mama didn't raise no idiot,
So, I'm trying to read between the lines. So, are you implying that you had some intimations of these things before you got tenure?
Actually, I used to believe in Darwin's theory, and it was only around the time I got tenure, maybe a year before, that I read a book called Evolution and Theory in Crisis by a man named Michael Behe that it kind of shocked me by pointing out problems for Darwin's theory that I had never thought of.
Right.
So I was led to I thought that I was led to believe this rather than it being based on the best evidence. So it was right around the time that I started to think about this, but it was only 5 years or so later that I got publicly involved in the ID movement.
Right. Well, and right now, I mean, obviously, since you have tenure, they're stuck with you, and I feel bad for them because you're clearly not a scientist. But look, the idea that the climate in the world of the academy is today such that people who discover things are afraid even about being honest. In other words, you're not talking about pushing anything. You're just talking about saying, I've discovered these things. What do we make of them? Let us reason together. That's supposed to be the idea of education and of the academy.
Yes, it is supposed to be that. Unfortunately, there are things you can reason about and things that are assumed to be true and beyond discussion. And unfortunately, evolution in Darwin's theory in particular is one of those things. And you entertain this idea if you don't have tenure at great risk to your career if you're a scientist. I've known people who have lost jobs, graduate students who have been kicked out of laboratories, all sorts of bad stuff. So it's a very serious topic.
Well, I mean, I guess when I hear this, again, I say it makes me angry that that kind of stuff goes on in America, because I expect it to happen, in the former Soviet Union. I expect it to happen under National Socialism. I expect it to happen in Kim Jong-un's Korea, until perhaps today when he saw the light. Who knows what's happening? When that kind of stuff happens in America, it's shocking to me, and I just say this publicly. We all have to stand against this, not because you believe in a certain theory, but because we're talking about truth-seeking and we're talking about freedom. And it's an amazing thing to me that you've been able to be so good-natured about this as you've proceeded in doing what is gigantically important work without being honored by the institution that employs you, because clearly the climate is such that you can't do that. But I do think that since this ballroom is not paid for by any university, we can honor you by not only having you here and hearing from you, but by thanking you for doing what you're doing. So I want to say thank you for being with us, and thank you for all you've done. I'm just stunned. Thank you so much.